Our mission is to promote, support, and expand quality mentoring that fosters positive youth development and academic success, job, and career readiness. We're a public-private partnership with DCYF, Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and we work and provide training, quality assurance, funding, and resources to 100+ organizations across Washington state. So I just want to give a shout out to everyone on the line. We have today's session will be called Culturally Responsive Mentoring. Throughout the COVID health pandemic, mentors, youth development providers have stepped up to meet the needs of youth. From dropping off food, supplies during the school year, dropping off toys during the holidays, recording videos to engage and inform, teaching and mentoring online. And I use the term teaching and mentoring sometimes interchangeably because mentor doesn't translate to every language. When you do translate it, mentor often translates to the word educator. So we are all educators on this call. So I want to give a big shout out to all of the educators, mentors, and youth development workers on this call and not on this call. So big air horn, air horn. So I talked about the health pandemic, but as a sector, we must also contend with the long-lasting racial and economic pandemics that threaten our democracy. Youth of color, immigrants, youth from low-income backgrounds, youth identifying across the LGBTQAI+ spectrum, youth in foster care, rural youth, urban youth have been navigating these systems of inequality, and we must do the work to meet the needs towards structural well-being. And I take that term structural well-being from the Burns Institute to build asset-based language instead of trauma-informed. We talk about structural well-being practices that take into consideration the lived and epigenetic experiences of the people that we serve. So that's why I'm so excited to bring my two dear, triple dear friends to talk about culturally responsive mentoring and youth development, Jamel Mims and Augustina Warton. What's up? Everyone put a soul clap to that. How are you? How are you? Vic, if you could spotlight the three of us, that would be lovely.
Okay. Do you guys see the spotlight for Jamel and Augustina and James
yes.
now? Okay, perfect.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So first, let's just get to know you. Who are you? Augustina, tell me about yourself.
Hey, I'm just changing my name here, rename. Okay, cool. My name is Augustina. Hey, everybody. My pronouns are she, her, just so everyone knows. I live in New York City. I've been here for about 12 years, surprisingly. In a lot of ways, I can't believe I'm still here. I'm originally from Massachusetts, from Boston. And I've worked in arts education since I was a kid. I grew up in youth development programs, arts education programs in Western Massachusetts. And I'm just kind of trying to pay back and live up to all the people who gave to me growing up and use what I've learned to also work with young people. And right now I work at City College as a professor in the art department teaching arts education, lots of different classes, intro to art, culture responsive pedagogy, methods of teaching art, all of that good stuff. So nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to get to know you too.
Thanks, Augustina. Jamel Mims.
What's happening, everybody? Augustina, good to be back in the room with you. James, always James the plug, forever. Shout outs to James. And definitely have to, I see some other familiar faces and familiar profile pictures and names up in the space. Got to shout out my man, Isaiah.
What's up, Isaiah?
Yeah.
Got
to shout out Isaiah. Danny Nicolosi. My man Brian Everson, and so just I'm glad that we can build this community together. It's awesome to be back in this space or to connect virtually. I'm trying to think. James and Augustina and I met. It might be 7 or 8 years ago now, and worked together in New York City, in particular around bringing culturally responsive pedagogy into New York City classrooms on, on a massive basis. And this is before there were citywide initiatives around culturally responsive pedagogy, or CRP. We work specifically around, bringing a culturally responsive approach from everything from test prep to like computer science to arts integration to storytelling. And so it's, awesome that we're able to form up again like Voltron to bring this approach towards the much needed task of actually connecting young people up with mentors, real life mentors, and the opportunity that we actually have now in this like remote learning space where everything has been flattened into like our Zoom window universes, but it's actually brought the ability of mentors to connect with young people a lot closer than it's actually ever been in the past. And so it's kind of an exciting opportunity. A little bit just quickly about myself. I'm a rapper, a multimedia artist, and a revolutionary. I'm an organizer with the Refuse Fascism, which has been organizing to drive the Trump and Pence regime out of office. And I am a bilingual rapper and using the approach of, culturally responsive pedagogy, both in the classroom and on stage, known in China as MC Ting Budong, which is translated means I don't understand. Newsflash, I do. I currently am a fellow at USC for the Civic Media Fellowship, sponsored by in support from MacArthur Foundation. Got to be really careful with that language. And currently work at Schools That Can, directing their education to employment pipeline. And so this is a series of programs where we actually have programming for young people to connect them with real life mentors, professionals. I would encourage everybody to check us out to build this community, and then also teach them really foundational skills and things like resume writing and cover letter writing, but really looking at this question of what does career and college readiness look like for a generation of digital natives, and how has that actually been transformed entirely by the pandemic? And so I'm so glad to be a part of the conversation.
That's dope. Appreciate you both being here, as Vic said in the chat. Thank you, thank you. So, you mentioned culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive practices. We've talked about this, going on almost over a decade in our work together. How do you define it, and why is it important? And then really important for people on this call, what does it look like in action? So let's start with the beginning. How do you define it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, whether when you shout out culture responsive pedagogy, you got to shout out, figures like Chris Emden, like Gloria Latson-Billings, and really looking at, I think the NEA, the National Education Alliance definition that we've worked from for a long time has really been looking at the performance styles and the attitudes of young people, and then how are you teaching to and through their strengths? And so how do young people see themselves in the classroom? And I think one real distinction that, James, I definitely got to big you up for, has really been looking in particular at youth culture as a culture, not a monolithic culture, but in the same way that we respect people's ethnic and cultural heritage, making room and actually both respecting and incorporating youth culture as a culture inside of spaces where they traditionally are not. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance that happens for young people, where in every venue outside of an academic place, youth culture is treated as something that is extremely high value. You have, Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart, during
the Puppy Bowl, right?
during the Puppy Bowl, extremely high value. But when they get into a school building or an academic environment, they're told to strip away all those parts. They're told to strip away, their identities. They're told to put their phones away, and this can't be a device for learning, right? Culturally responsive pedagogy flips all of that on its head and actually says these are actually pathways to not just engage young people, but that can actually show where they can be excellent. And so that's a real fold around, a real grain of wisdom around culturally responsive pedagogy I like to walk with, is teaching to and through the strengths of our young people.
Word. Thank you. Yeah. And Augustina, how does that play in when you teach the teacher, when you train the trainer,
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, like Jamel was saying, it's looking at all of different cultural backgrounds and strengths that our young people have, and um, really finding ways to kind of subvert the system so that you can really articulate what is accepted, and then also kind of moving beyond that. So I've worked a lot with like frameworks around really understanding, like, you know, we hear about all of these things like you know, Common Core standards or stuff that you have to align in lesson plans, or different benchmarks that you have to hit with grant requirements, and really understanding that, but then also being able to articulate how do you then relate that to the skills that you're learning through other ways of teaching, like using music, using art, using dance, using all these different ways that people learn, but perhaps, you know, they're not the kind of dichotomous way that we're taught in terms of just kind of giving information and then sitting back and listening to it. It's really an approach to giving information and then allowing people to also use their own strengths and knowledge that they have in affirming that and putting that into practice in lots of different ways. So it depends on the context of where people are working and who you're teaching. But I think it's looking at really understanding how you approach a situation through an icebreaker, through get to know you activities, really deeply understanding what your students relate to best, and then finding ways to incorporate that as an educator into your trainings or into your classes.
Word. Now, how are you tapping into the resources of the communities and the youth that you serve? And I ask that given the fact that a lot of the work we're doing here in Washington State is online and remote. Like I know in Massachusetts, people are back in school. I know in New York City public schools are hybrid for the most part. How's this affected your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely affected my work with New York City school students, where it's been, this year has been entirely virtual. And it's been an entirely different, we've had to really like redefine our parameters around engagement. And then also just really think about, okay, well, what, you know, again, what does college and career readiness, what does career readiness look like? What does finding a mentor and matching young people up with mentors look like? You know, and finding these types of opportunities look like in a situation of extreme inequity, right? Where like, you know, where the extreme inequality of the system that we actually live under has been just barely, you know, laid bare and exposed, and enveloped within those twin pandemics of both the coronavirus pandemic and then, you know, racial injustice, right? And then, you know, in the fall, a crescendo of fascism that ended in an insurrection, right? Or paused rather than an insurrection. And so it's really a lot to, you know, you think about all of that. It's, you know, our young people are going through a lot, you know, we're living through a historic moment right now. And so I think one thing has really been to like really remind ourselves that that's actually the situation that we're in, and really bringing that face to face with the students. But then I think it's also really been a real question of, you know, all right, well, now let's actually look at this and see this, you know, let's see where the opportunities actually lie in this space. You know, people are, you know, everyone is home now or remote or hybrid or has had to learn to adapt in this type of scenario. And setting up, you know, a one-day long internship for a young person is extremely difficult, right? But navigating, you know, 1 hour Zoom session with a young person and a career, you know, aligned mentor is actually much more logistically possible. And so where do these actual opportunities lie? And so, you know, I felt, you know, with taking that kind of approach, it's really helped to like think about what opportunities actually lie in this space. And then also just really looking at the way that young people engage with and use technology, and taking a lot of leadership from that and redesigning our parameters around engagement around it. Like I'm sure if folks here are teaching in virtual classrooms, you get a whole lot of this.
Exactly.
But learning how to actually deal with, okay, well, all right, if folks are going to keep their cameras off, throw your mics off and let's do this like we're in Clubhouse, and I'll pull some
Right.
people up to the stage, and finding the forums that young people are actually already engaging in, and bringing that into the classroom, whether that's virtual, remote, or hybrid.
Can you tell people what Clubhouse is?
Yeah, so Clubhouse is like an audio only social media chat where you can you find people with common interest, you start rooms, and then you are able to have conversations with them. So it kind of bridges the podcast format where you have people on a panel speaking, but then anyone from the audience can actually jump up to the panel, and it's interactive in the way that social media is, where you can jump up and make a comment and actually become part of the panel. And so this is just over the past year has become a super popular form of social media. And
it's by invite only.
So far, right. Yeah, it's in open beta right now. Yep.
Right, open beta right now. Yeah. We're talking about workforce. Can you talk about collaboration? How do you collaborate with different sectors, right? Whether that's in the higher ed format or working with youth themselves. How do you collaborate with different sectors?
Can we pass this down to Isaiah in the crowd?
Of course.
Oh wow, look at that. Yeah, move on.
Can I pass that to you, Isaiah? Because I think like in thinking about mentoring and thinking about how we do things here is that we share a lot of just our everyday experience, no matter what level a young person is at with the people around us. And Isaiah is someone that we've worked with for the last 8 years, I would say. Started as a young person, is now a brilliant community leader,
yes.
Working in Uptown in Washington Heights, and doing some amazing work. So I think he's really collaborating with the community and with programs, and I'll let you kind of talk, Isaiah. I don't want to talk for you, but I just wanted to give you a little introduction to Isaiah, just really quick.
You're on mute, bro. Or
your audio's not working.
Your audio's not working.
Yeah. I think your audio's not working.
You guys hear me?
Yes.
There you go. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Put you on the spot, Isaiah.
I missed a little chunk of what was going on, but I'm happy to see everybody though, and thank y'all for the love. I think the last piece I heard was mentorship. So I'll just go off on that. I think no matter on what level you're in, it's important to collaborate. I know for myself, I learned from people that are people younger than me, and I think that kind of helps me with what I'm doing. And even just like Augustina, Jamel, Siobhan, those folks kind of putting me in that space with them as they were growing too, and it allowed me to get a lot of information which I took here. So no matter what level you're in, it's important to kind of learn from young people, listen to them. I hope I answered the question. I didn't get a chunk of.
It was just a little bit about like how do you collaborate with the different stakeholders around you or different people around you. So
Yeah,
I mean, thank you for that. Yeah, young people are your biggest stakeholders. That's all I'll say.
I love that. I love that. I love that phraseology. Young people are your biggest stakeholders. I also want to highlight the fact that it's like squad on this call. Siobhan's on here too. So as a model for culture responsive mentoring or programming, it's when one of us shows up, we all show up, right? And that's like we bring each other together. I love that. So here's something that's going to be a key question, and people have been writing about it for a long time. Chris Emden, you mentioned, Dr. Bettina Love, the homie, she writes about it too. What should white mentors know about working with youth of color, and how do they apply culture responsive practices in the work?
Yeah, people, so I'd like to invite up now.
let me bring up
Let me bring up. Yeah. No, I mean, people throwing in the chat, $1 million question. Like, look, this is a central question. I mean, I think, look, I think we actually have to really get beyond the politics of allyship, where we are no longer seeing the struggles of isolated people who happen to be different than us by gender or skin color as their struggles, and our duty as something as being able to support somebody in that, right? Like, everybody is not something. You don't get a choice over actually where you're born or what you're born as, but you do get a choice about what you actually live your life to do. And so, look, I stand, and I've said this before, either in classrooms, on street corners with a megaphone, and, to friends, but that I stand shoulder to shoulder with anybody that's willing to fight injustice, right? And that we see this as all of our fight actually on this. And so, and while keeping that as a preface, we do actually have to acknowledge the structural realities that put Black and brown young people in particular, especially at a time like the coronavirus pandemic, where Black and brown communities have been, not just, targeted by things like police murder, but actually where the wealth and healthcare infrastructure of those communities has again been just laid bare, and you can just really see that disparity. You do have to walk in with that understanding and with that knowledge, but it is, I think we have to get beyond the idea of seeing that struggle or their struggle or the struggle for Black Lives Matter as something that's over there, right? But that actually is, look, that's your struggle too. That's something you actually have to take, a front seat in terms of a front seat towards dismantling, right? In the same way that the freedom riders in the early 60s and late 50s, who went down to places like Greensboro, South Carolina, right? And integrated the lunch counters in the same way that they saw that, that was much higher stakes, right? They wrote their wills, but those were multiracial coalitions, right? And it actually couldn't have just been done if there was a kind of delegation of leadership on the basis of skin color, right? Those were not things that said, they did not proceed with an ethos that said the white people there are our allies. They actually went in with like, they're here getting spat on just like us. They're here, under fear of getting lynched just like us, right? And so I think it's with that attitude and with that spirit that we have to actually, enter into this. And, again, while acknowledging the same structural realities that like Black and brown mentees will actually be facing. Yeah, I'll go with that.
If I could just add a little bit to that, I think that also acknowledging, like, as someone who has a lot of light skin privilege, acknowledging white privilege and talking about it as something that actually exists allows and dispels, like, for folks of color to kind of be able to speak about race more openly. Because what I find is, like, oftentimes my students who are mostly Black and Latino are not saying, they won't say white. They're like scared to say it. They'll be like, but miss, this white person over there will be, it's like you can't point it out when, like, the color of their skin is always being pointed out. Black and brown kids, Black and brown, but we're never identifying white people as white people. And so I think pointing out white privilege, talking about it as a white person, saying that, I acknowledge it, and also, like Jamel was saying, being willing to be uncomfortable and give up some of that power. And a lot of that is uplifting voices, young voices of color, to be able to be in positions of power. And being okay with being the person in the sidelines, if you have more of that privilege, to coach and to be able to support other folks who may not have the same opportunities as it relates to your white skin privilege, I think. And understanding where you are in general on a spectrum of privilege, even as it doesn't relate to skin color, I think is also super important.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about, like as Fred Hampton coined the Rainbow Coalition, you know, what we're talking about is dangerous, which is operating with a sense of love and grace and inviting others along with us. Uh, how do you invigorate, buttress, support that courage for both white mentors, mentoring Black and brown youth, and then for, you know, as you were saying, Augustina, young people that look like us to say, okay, I can open my ears to what you're saying. I can take a step forward as well. The mentor is going to have to take 10 steps forward, and we'll take one step forward to meet them. But how do you invoke that sense of courage and ownership over the process of like identifying your privilege? You know, whether it's light skin privilege, white privilege, male privilege for that matter. How do you take an ownership of that and say like, hey, I'm in it together. Let's do this.
Yeah, go for it, Augustina.
I think when I'm working with young people and also my students at City College, who are most of them coming from New York City public schools, are folks of color themselves. I think that we I really look at who's in the syllabus and who's not, and start with probably start with a reading that is really identifying with someone who is going to speak to people who aren't traditionally acknowledged in the common way that we teach in you know, mainstream education. So, you know, we're going to grasp and I'm going to show you, you exist here too. The knowledge here that exists is not always going to be the traditional Eurocentric way of learning. So maybe it's an artist who doesn't, and someone who doesn't have a degree, and it's the first person I'm going to show in a class, or someone's artwork who, you know, is very underrepresented. I think it's really affirming identities and showing folks that you exist here, you exist in history, your stories exist, and currently your stories exist, they're just not being told. So how do we as people in the classroom who have been historically underrepresented and are continually underrepresented, how do we begin to have a louder voice and show show folks who perhaps maybe aren't aware of that we're here, and how do we get those folks to acknowledge it too? And so I think on the other side of that is also getting white people to teach other stories and to speak to those stories loudly, and to lower the level of the Eurocentrism in you know, everything that you teach and do.
No doubt.
Yeah, I feel really close to that. I think, you know, we have to, you know, I'm going to use an overused phrase, but drill it down a bit. But, you know, I think you really have to keep it real, right? And just what I mean by that is we have to be bulldogged about the truth and about fighting for the truth, and especially now, right? Is it true that this country and what it was founded on is, you know, Jeffersonian ideals, and, you know, that all men can be equal, all men are created equal, or was this country founded on slavery and genocide? Like, what, we actually have the history of this, and, you know, and we have to investigate it and tell the truth about it. And that the truth is agnostic, you know, doesn't give a damn what your skin color is, right? Like, and we have to be, you know, I think, you know, as Augustina was saying, like having white people, having men tell the stories of, you know, the oppression of women, having white people tell the stories of the oppression of Black and brown people, you know, having these types of people, you know, why is it important for them to tell those stories? Look, these are true stories, right? And it's not just a matter of like narrative or, you know, their truth or what's true to this person or someone else, but they actually are historically and factually accurate and true, right? And in the same way that over the past year, people really trained their scientific brain around the coronavirus pandemic and like navigating through all these conspiracy theories, we need to actually have the same kind of discipline to actually fight for this around social issues. And that includes with education and mentorship. And so I think this thing of keeping it real and acknowledging social realities, but really fighting for the truth and having that, you know, regardless of who you are or what your personal background is, approaching it in the same way that a scientist approaches how they would solve or cure a disease, and are looking for what's the actual true answer, how like, how a Black doctor or a white doctor would not ignore the actual realities of a pandemic or a disease, right? You know, we need to do the same thing as educators and the same thing as mentors when it comes to history, when it comes to telling the truth about society and the real structural realities. And so just to like really drill that, you know, that also demands on us being investigators and actually continuing to learn, all right? I mean, I think a lot of people might get the impression that like somebody like James or Augustina just has a natural propensity towards like being able to speak to youth, or how many people on this chat have gotten, you know, that kind of feedback, you know, shout out Siobhan and Isaiah, like, oh man, you're just really good at talking to young people. And it's like, you know, you're good at it because you actually study it. You actually look at youth culture and you actually look at the connections, and, you know, and you actually, you know, is it true that the culture that young people have less of a grasp of reality than adults? No, that's not true. You know, so why should there be any validity between code switching or using one set of languages or terms in one arena versus another? You know, these things should actually be put in an equitable footing. But it starts with this thing of actually, you know, keeping it real, acknowledging these social realities, you know, and continuing to be an investigator and learning. You know, while we're matching young people up with mentors and having them have conversations around what it means to be in a specific career, industry, or field, you know, I think it would do a disservice to young people if you didn't actually acknowledge or talk about, you know, institutional racism as it shows up in those fields and what it's like to be like the only Black person at an organization, you know, or a Black CEO or in leadership, right? Like you're doing a disservice to them if you actually aren't addressing those. And so, you know, I think this thing, and a person can do that whether they themselves are Black or not, right? And so I think this thing of really keeping it real and acknowledging the social realities and fighting for the truth, no matter where we personally come from or what our personal experiences are, is a compass that we can actually hold on to.
Thank you.
To remain
Thank you
culturally responsive. Yep.
Yep, for sure. And
Just to add a little bit to that, James, did you want to move on?
no, I was going to say, you know, we're going to jump into breakout soon. I had another question, but I don't want to cut you off, Augustina.
Just like making sure that we're thinking about those points that Jamel made at an institutional level, as well as like a programmatic and individual level, because I think it's often left at an individual level and not looked at in the structures and design of organizations. So if you are someone who is like James, an executive director, what exists in your policies and your procedures and your frameworks that is actually ensuring that this type of work is being done? That can go towards like, okay, in my department, I want to make sure that you know, I'm teaching at least 5 of my classes that are looking at the roots of racism in education. And that can be in different ways, but at least 5 of them are looking at that. You know, and in a 14 session class, so that I'm making sure that the students in my class really understand what's happening. And that's a dictation from the department head that's cleared by the whoever, you know, and so that it's kind of a trickle down effect, so that it's required at every level also, because people are going to be really uncomfortable. We've done this work a lot in lots of different spaces, and it's not easy. It's very uncomfortable for folks to really look at their own privilege and question it, and then also design procedures and policies that may not actually benefit them in the long run, for different reasons. So yeah, I think all of that is just important to consider. Yeah.
You actually touched on my next question, which was leadership. What do we do? And you just led that beautifully. Thanks for that transition, Augustina. It made me think of all. Remember when we were in South by Southwest in the McMillan room, and this was right after they had their textbooks that said Africans came to America as workers, and we just stood there in front of McMillan like, you really gonna, this is what you're putting out?
Like, we're not gonna eat your free food anymore.
Exactly.
It's like the flavor of those salmon burgers just started to,
This don't taste very good, right? So Vic, can you put us into breakout rooms and like a 5 or 6 people per breakout room? And I want us to think about this question. What are you doing? What can you do as a leader today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? What action steps can you take today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year? Let's talk about that as in small groups.